Hi, everyone, and welcome to another episode of Unpacking Possibility. I'm your host, Tracy Stein, and as always, I'm so happy to be here with you today. I really love doing these podcasts. I love connecting with you here and offline, and I hope that what you learn today and every time you listen is something that helps make your life a little bit richer or easier or better in some way. So today I'd like to talk about a topic that most people shy away from. And there's a good reason for that. And I'm going to talk about grief, but not in the way you might expect. We normally think about grief as the loss of a loved one, a family member, a friend, a partner, or a pet. And it's, of course, incredibly painful. But that is not what I'm going to talk about today. Because grief really extends far beyond that type of loss. And actually, the grief we experience most often has nothing to do with that. But it has everything to do with change. And change is one of those few inevitable qualities to life, right? That no matter what we did, things would change. We would change. Our world would change. One day to the next, we experience inevitable change. Now, most changes we probably don't even notice that much, but the ones that feel most impactful or generate a lot of nostalgia or wistfulness or longing, or the grass used to be greener, those types of feelings, those are the ones that cause a type of grief. And it can be similarly painful, actually, to the loss of a being. So I want to just explain that. Most of us have been experiencing a ton of change related to the pandemic, right? In terms of how we work, our ability to socialize. Perhaps we've had changes in our health. Our entire world has changed. So even if you haven't been thinking about it this way, chances are you have been experiencing grief of some sort, as well as other emotions, of course, for the last few years. But the other day-to-day changes and life changes that we all experience in some form or another can generate grief that if we don't understand that's what it is, we can continue reacting in a way that isn't helpful to us or to our relationships, and that makes it harder to move forward. So some examples of things we tend to grieve over are things like a change in our work life. Now, this might be going from one job to another or one position to another, or even something as simple as having your desk moved from one place to another, or where you work, your location changing from one thing to another. What happens often is that when we have even kind of an expectable or kind of everyday type of change like that, we can all of a sudden feel like this attachment, to the life that we had or the working conditions we had, even if what's happening now is technically better or something that we wanted or in fact that we advocated for. Similarly, I'm using the job example because it's something that, again, has happened to most people, but I'll mention other examples in a moment. But we can apply for a job and get it. And maybe this means more money or a different type of exposure or just an atmosphere that generally we think will be better for us. But as we accept that, we necessarily leave behind the past. So we may be leaving behind friends or friendly relationships that we made at work. We can be leaving behind this sense of routine, right? And sometimes our stress level is lower for a lot of people once they're in the groove and don't have to think about things so much. I mean, even just going to a new job and having to learn where things are or new procedures can cause stress. And that can make us idealize the thing we just left. Other examples of things we might grieve over will be transitions in our lives, like certainly physical transitions. If we used to be relatively healthy and we develop an illness that changes the way we look or function or both, Absolutely. That is one of the most common types of grief that I have seen in my practice, actually, is somebody saying, I long for the self I used to be. And again, it's not only missing what was in actuality, but what our minds do when we are feeling sad or disempowered in some way is we can wind up further idealizing that thing that we used to have, even if we didn't appreciate it at all then. And then we can have all kinds of guilt and so forth and regret over not appreciating the thing that we had. And we'll talk more a little bit later in the podcast about what we can do to try and prevent that from happening or reduce that type of reaction, going forward, but also when we're in the midst of it. When we go from one stage of life to another, that is a common time when we grieve. And we often think that children and teenagers and young adults don't grieve if they haven't experienced a significant and very obvious loss. And in fact, a lot of times I'll hear adults or parents saying that, what does that kid have to worry about? We had it so differently. It's so much easier for them. And that might be true in many ways. But if you think back, you may remember that when you went from grade school to high school, there might have been excitement about high school. There might have been anxiety. There may be both. And there may have been grief over the loss of the friendships and, again, the setting and the routine and just knowing how to do things kind of automatically by the point, by that time that you leave. Going from high school to college, very common to experience all kinds of changes and for those changes to also induce feelings of grief for, quote, the simpler times, right? Because the things we're used to doing become easier for us than the things that are new and stretch us in some way. Going from being single to being formally partnered or married. It can be something that's super exciting, but there can be a part of you that says, oh, but I will never again have, and whether it's just freedom to do things on your own and not have to consult anybody else when you make a decision or whatever it is, that's really, really common and normal and not something to be overly harsh with yourself if you're feeling it. Going from being a parent, or rather from being a person with no children to having a child or children. Very, very common, and people often feel guilty about having feelings about that. And again, it's so common because with every change, there are things we get and there are things that we give up. Any change that seems less under your control or something you wouldn't choose, of course, is going to possibly, likely, in fact, induce more grief. So ending a relationship, even if you are the person who formally decided to end it, if there's something that precipitated you making that decision, a partner's infidelity or a change in that partner's ability to engage in the relationship otherwise, there may be a part of you that even if you're the one to say, I can't do this anymore, there may be grief over the times when things were good. And when you didn't have to think about being on your own, or when you didn't have to think about, how will I find somebody new that feels like a good fit? What if I don't? So often grief can come along with other emotions, and other emotions can prompt or worsen the grief. So worry, feeling helpless, feeling angry, feeling, again, like your life has changed in some way that induces feelings that feel hard to sit with. And then again, what was before feels idealized. So other things that, I alluded to this before, but I'm going to be more specific. Going from a physical developmental stage to another, to the next one. Now, often those things are accompanied by other types of life changes, right? If you retire, you might be super excited to be retiring after all of these years of working hard. But not only are you leaving the job and the routine and the professional identity, but you also may be noticing that, again, your body has changed quite a bit. Your appearance has changed because you are now likely quite a bit older. Certainly older than you probably were when you entered the workforce. So whether it's the gray hair or the changes in your skin or the changes in your body or your endurance or how your joints feel or whatever it is, that can be quite difficult. Now, something that women in particular can experience, whether or not they've had children, whether or not they have wanted them, and this is something that very few people talk about, even in therapy, is the transition from being premenopausal to postmenopausal. And not only does that, of course, come with all kinds of changes, many women out there will know exactly what I'm talking about in the texture and dryness of your hair and your skin, and again, your mobility, your metabolism. Some people experience changes in memory, and sometimes that's just temporary, and sometimes it's a little bit more ongoing. But beyond that, someone can feel like they are mourning when they experience the loss of their menstrual cycle. Now, people who still have their menstrual cycle and are listening to this may be like, especially if you have a really painful one, you might feel like, I kind of wish I didn't have this. And that's also completely normal, right? But on the other side of that cessation of menstruation can be both very literal in terms of the changes you notice. You notice that there's a different kind of hormonal rhythm, but also there is a symbolic quality. You are now over a threshold where you will not have children at all, or you won't have any additional ones. And you can feel that grief even if that isn't something you really wanted. And I'm thinking about people, again, who've come into my practice and grieved just such a thing. And I remember when I was younger having a harder time understanding that, because in my mind I thought, well, you had this, kind of lengthy window to make those choices. And of course, fast forward a few decades, I understand quite clearly that our grief over anything does not have to be, quote, rational. And whether or not someone else gets it, it's still your emotion. It's still your process. It's still legitimate. It's what you're feeling. It's your truth of the moment. And so that kind of brings me to the next thing about what can you do if you are feeling like, I'm just not feeling great about this, or I feel myself longing for the past or idealizing it because I know that when I was back there, I wasn't singing zippity-doo-dah every day, thinking how great something was. But now I'm really looking back and saying, if only I could have those times again. So one thing you can do is, people talk about meditation to the point that I'm sure that it seems just like blah, blah, blah. Everybody says meditation. But when you do, even for 5 minutes a day, try to cultivate a present moment awareness. Just being in the moment, noticing your thoughts, but returning your awareness to one thing, your breath, a sensation in your body, the birds chirping outside, or whatever it is, and you breathe through and detach from everything else for that time period. What it does is it helps you to not only diffuse unpleasant emotions, but it helps you to see them in context. And it creates space. So what happens is there's less suffering in general. And also it's, if you think about an old school camera, and I don't know how many people will relate to this or not, but, if you had a telephoto lens, right? You can think about this with your smartphone as well. But if you zoom in on something, that is really the only thing in the frame of your awareness. And so when we zoom in on feelings of loss or sadness or helplessness, what happens is it really eclipses everything else and it prolongs that suffering. And if you imagine either on an old school, SLR camera where you're now widening your frame, you're opening up and that field, and you are seeing a bigger picture, right? Or you're doing that with your smartphone, and you're getting a lot more in the frame. the mental version of that allows us to see other things, other options, other opportunities. So we see things not as, well, I left this partner 10 years ago and, if only I were still in that relationship. We're not just seeing the good moments, but we're seeing the entire picture. And that there were probably good reasons for you to decide to move on and to move forward. And that, in fact, you have chosen many of the things that you have in your present at this moment. And you get to choose a lot of what you will pick in the days ahead of you. And that's a wonderful thing. But it helps, again, diffuse emotions in general, not just grief, but anger, sadness, frustration. It helps diffuse emotions that feel like a lot to sit with, and that can kind of amplify negative, catastrophic thinking. So meditation for you, if you feel overwhelmed and feel like you can't sit still, might be getting out and taking a walk and bringing your awareness to the feeling of the air on your skin. Or just noticing the things on the path ahead of you. And that's literally as simple as it has to be, but bringing yourself to the moment. Because how many times are we walking our dogs and thinking about everything but the fact that we are spending time with the sentient being that we hopefully love, that we really only have for a limited amount of time? Every experience, from the magnificent to the mundane, will become something that we have more of, and will be more fulfilling if we allow ourselves to be present. So that means putting down the smartphone and maybe not trying to focus so much on distraction from either everyday life or from unpleasant feelings, but breathing through them. So that's kind of a lot of, there are so many ways to do mindfulness, but that's really important. The other thing I feel like is super helpful is journaling. And even if you're somebody who's like, oh, that's corny, or I don't like to do that, buying an inexpensive notebook and just writing things down as they come to mind invariably winds up revealing to you other things you hadn't been consciously noticing. So as you're writing down, just giving yourself permission to write whatever comes to mind, not censoring it. You can throw the journal out when you're done if you want, but I feel so sad. This job is so stressful. Why did I pick this? I used to love seeing my friends at lunchtime at the old job, and it was so much easier. It can actually, as you keep writing, reveal something that, is important, and that may help diffuse your grief over time. I get nervous when I feel like I'm not doing something well. Or I have a hard time making decisions. But if I think about it, every time I've picked a new job, after the first 6 months, I felt happier, and so forth. So you wind up noticing things that you didn't notice before. That often can be very helpful. The other thing is, whether you're doing mindfulness meditation or journaling or listening to guided imagery or something that you find helps you recenter, we can move all of these things help us move forward from grief, because not only do they help us to recenter, but when I talked about the aperture of the camera, widening that aperture, widening that view, what I mean is that the view doesn't only include the whole picture of the past, but it includes the whole picture of your present and all of the options before you, many of which you may not have noticed. And it helps us to notice potential in the future, including potentials that we may not have had we not had to move on from something or chosen to move on from something, right? So, for example, if you tended to be in a rut with your former partner and didn't go out and engage in activities or meet people because the partner didn't like to do that, well, as you move forward, whether you're single or partnered with somebody else, you may find that you now have more freedom to make time for social activities and creating friendships and expanding your horizon that maybe you wouldn't have done before. So that's just one example. So I should have pointed this out before, but I want to make sure to just quickly mention there are times when you will be feeling just not good, but not realize that you have grief. And grief can present in the classic way that we all imagine, where you're saying, I feel so bereft, I'm crying, I'm sad, I can't stop thinking about this other thing or this previous time in my life and so forth. That's more obvious. But you might just feel like apathetic, not engaged in things, more tired, more irritable, right? So you might find that you're less tolerant of everyone and everything because you're still feeling overwhelmed by or saddened by or regretful about this thing that has moved into your past. And of course, this happens to grief that we feel about a loved one, of course, but we may feel that about other things. Again, you can even move from one home to another and be super excited, on paper at least, about the new home and still feel grief about the fact that you built a lot of memories in the old home, even if it wasn't maybe your ideal. And I'm laughing as I say this to you because I'm thinking, I remember my first apartment where I lived on my own. Moving out on my own was really important and liberating. And it also happened to be an overpriced 400 square foot microscopic one bedroom that was a fourth floor walk up. That had a sloped floor and, the windows weren't well insulated, right? So when I moved on to the next thing, it was super exciting, but there were memories made in that other first apartment. It represented a lot. So all of this is to say, give yourself space if you are feeling grief over any kind of change. We're all experiencing more changes than we normally would now, again, because we've been living in a pandemic world for a few years now. And so in addition to all of the other changes that we might have had anyway, or maybe some other ones that were prompted by this pandemic, we're all sitting with a lot. We're sitting with a lot of change. And again, just to summarize, what I would say is if you're feeling kind of off and you aren't sure what it is, absolutely things like meditation, moving your body as well. That's a type of meditation, journaling, doing some guided imagery, whatever it is that helps you recenter and helps you, again, widen that lens and put things in context and kind of, de-stress, recenter. Super duper important, extra important now. Be aware that symptoms of grief aren't just limited to the loss of a being, and that you can be feeling grief even if you're not aware that that's what it is. And the final thing, of course, is remember that everything that moves into the past opens the door to something else in the future. And the wonderful thing is, the more aware you are, the more you can make some conscious choices to make that future feel more fulfilling, more rewarding, more exciting. And all of the techniques I just mentioned will help you to ride out the stress of adjusting to all of those good things. So I hope this was helpful. It was great connecting with you again. If you have any thoughts or comments, please drop them in the comments if you're listening on YouTube, or drop me a line, follow me on Facebook or Instagram. Let me know how you're doing. And if you like the podcast, please do like, share, and subscribe. Until next time, I wish you all the very best. Be well.